Today on Sports Betting Truth, I'm going to present to you a highly requested video about Monte Carlo simulations and what they entail. It's one of the most common questions I get asked. What is a Monte Carlo simulation? Well, consider this video to be Monte Carlo 101 or Monte Carlo for Dummies. But before I begin, I just want to point out that this video is brought to you by our friends at BetMGM. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I don't trust offshore sportsbooks at all. I used to be a customer of one, a well-known one. They shut down operations to American customers a few months ago and left everyone scrambling to try to get their money out before they shut down. And the process was very stressful. They kept denying my payout request. They finally paid it out, but it was a stressful time, and I was wondering if I was ever going to get that money out. It was a significant amount of money, and I was pretty stressed, and I finally got it, but I was like, I would never want to do that again. And that's where our friends at BetMGM come into play. Sign up for their mobile app so you can get betting stateside without having to send your money overseas to the overseas casino. You're already taking a risk by placing bets to begin with. Why take another? Keep the money in the States where you can have the safety and peace of mind by depositing in a stateside book that is actually regulated and not a mystery. Now, if you live in Tennessee, Colorado, Indiana, or Iowa, I have a link below in the description that you can use to sign up for BetMGM and get up to a $500 instant deposit match. That's right, up to $500 of free money that BetMGM will let you play with at their book. That sounds like a good idea, right? You have two options. Send your money overseas to God knows where and take that massive risk, or keep it stateside and get up to a $500 instant deposit match. For me, it's a no-brainer. So again, if you live in Tennessee, Iowa, Colorado, or Indiana, I have a link for you below to sign up for BetMGM, get up to a $500 instant deposit match. Now, the name Monte Carlo might seem complex, but all it really is just another name for simulations over a certain number of trials. Simulate something a certain number of times, that's your Monte Carlo run. Now, the idea of a Monte Carlo run is to eliminate randomness and smooth everything out and answer the question, if this happened infinite number of times, what would the average mean result be? That's what you're trying to answer with a Monte Carlo run. For example, if a basketball team played another basketball team a million times, what would the average final score be? Well, that's what you're trying to answer with the Monte Carlo run. Now, you're probably not going to be able to measure something a million times, but you get the idea. Now, Monte Carlo simulations are not that complex on the surface. I'm going to go through some examples to explain what exactly they are, but like I said, the idea of a Monte Carlo simulation, iron out the randomness, blend all these various probabilities into a single simulation and come up with a final result. You can measure a lot of things with Monte Carlo simulations, and it's one of my favorite ways to project sports matchups for sports betting purposes. I personally use Monte Carlo simulations for college basketball and Major League Baseball. You could probably do it for any sport as long as you have the statistics and are able to convert things into probabilities. So without any more time wasting, let's get started on the examples. All right, so on this spreadsheet right here, I have 4 different Monte Carlo examples we can walk through. So obviously, the most basic Monte Carlo simulation example we can do is a coin flip. Now, I will start by saying there's really no point in doing a coin flip Monte Carlo run because we already know what's going to happen over an infinite number of flips. It's going to fall 50-50, right? The thing with Monte Carlo simulations, you don't really need to do them if you already know what your expectation is going to be. The whole point of a Monte Carlo run is when you have so many different variables and so many different combinations that those probabilities can output, that you don't know what the expectation is going to be when you blend them all together. But for something simple like this, there's no need. But anyway, just for the sake of this example, I did do a coin flip run in R right here. So I already have it programmed out, so you don't have to see me typing in. But I'll just walk through it. So it loops through trials, so the number of flips pretty much equals trials, and counts how many heads and how many tails. So the runif command in R pretty much gives you a random number between 0 and 1. It's a decimal. And so flip, which is the result of the runif command, if it's less than or equal to 0.5, we're going to increase tails by 1. Otherwise, we're going to increase heads by 1. And we're going to print it out at the end, and we're going to do this however many times. So if we just do one flip, you know, anything can happen over one flip, right? 0, 1, or 10 flips. Anything can happen over 10 flips. 8 tails versus 2 heads, right? That can happen over 10 flips. You can get an 80% over 10, but when you start increasing the number of trials, now let's do 10,000, it's probably going to fall 50-50. Look at that. It's either been 49 or 50 the entire time, right? And that's what we're going to do. What if we do it 100,000 times? Yeah, even it's just going to fall 50-50. So the more you increase your number of trials, the less the deviation of all of the outcomes is going to be. As you approach infinity, it's going to be smoother and smoother, and you're going to fall in line with what the actual expectation is. We know 50-50 is the actual expectation for a coin flip, and that's what we did when we just simulated it 100,000 times. It fell pretty much 50 to 49.99, right? That is how a Monte Carlo works. The more you increase your number of simulations, the more you're going to approach the actual expectation. And I'll get into sample size in a bit, but let's move on. So example number 2, a coin flip and a dice roll. Again, you don't need to do a Monte Carlo for this because we already know what the result's going to be, right? If you're trying to answer the question, what's the probability of you flipping heads and then rolling a 3? Well, that's pretty easy. Equals D7 times G8, right? 0.5 times 0.167, you're going to get 0.80833. For some reason, it looks like that. But there you go, 8.3% chance of you flipping tails and then rolling a 3, about 1 in 12, right? You don't need to do a Monte Carlo run for that because we know what our expectation is going to be. You do that an infinite number of times. Every single combination is going to fall in the 8.3% range. So now you know what the absolute basics are. Let's move on to an actual sports example, and this is going to be a baseball example. So I pulled the season stats of Ross Detweiler and Nelson Cruz that I have in my baseball model from 2019. As well as the national averages. Now, to do a Monte Carlo run in sports, you have to convert everything into percentages and probabilities. If you can't do that, you can't do a Monte Carlo run. So that's what these numbers represent. So this is going to be a very basic example. So let's assume that Nelson Cruz is facing Ross Detweiler with the bases loaded, 2 outs in the 9th inning, and the Twins, who Nelson Cruz plays for, are down by 3 runs, right? So what we're going to do in this Monte Carlo simulation, we're trying to calculate the expectation of how many runs can theoretically be scored if Nelson Cruz faced Ross Detweiler in this situation like an infinite number of times. What's the expectation? Well, we know these 3 things. We know Ross Detweiler's averages on the season. He gives up a single about 16.4% of the time. He gives up a double about 5.2% of the time, a triple only 0.2%. Home run 4.3%, walk 8.6%, and he gets an out about 65.4% of the time. Nelson Cruz, meanwhile, he hits a single 7.9% of the time. He doubles 6.2% of the time. He never triples. Homers about 14.4% of the time, about 1 in 7. That's pretty good. Walks 9.1% and gets out about 62.4%. So, and here are the national averages. The national average batter or pitcher singles 14% of the time, or a pitcher gives up a single 14% of the time. Double 4.6%, triple 0.4%, home run 3.6%, walk 9.2%, and out 68.2%. So what we need to do is calculate expectation. And to calculate expectation, you first got to subtract the player's stats from the national average. So this is going to be Ross Detweiler, C5 minus E5. So Ross Detweiler gives up about 2.4% more singles than the league average pitcher would give up. And so we're going to do that for all of his stats. And as you can see, he's pretty much in line with the national average except for singles and outs. So that's kind of where he deviates. Nelson Cruz, on the other hand, we're going to see he doesn't hit a lot of singles, but he does do a lot of everything else. So he singles about 6.1% less of the time than the national average batter does. But look at this. He homers 10.8% more than the average batter does. That's pretty good. And he gets out about 5.8% less than the average batter, so he's a good hitter. So what we got to do now to get to the expectation calculation is sum these 2 things together. So we're going to do sum these 2. And we do that, and then we add that on to the national average to get our expectation. So equals H5 plus the national average E5. So we can expect Nelson Cruz to single about 10.3% of the time. He's going to double about 6.7% of the time. He's going to triple never, so we can change that to 0. And then he's going to homer about 5.1% of the time, walk 8.4% of the time, and get out about 60% of the time, right? So that's what these expectations represent. Now, in an actual Monte Carlo baseball model like mine, it's going to be a lot more complex than that. But for the sake of this video, I'm trying to keep it simple, right? In a real baseball Monte Carlo model, you're going to factor in things for expectation purposes like home advantage, park factors, weather, and things like that we're not doing for this example, just to keep it simple. But let's just assume that the weather is average, they're playing in a neutral park, and the park factor is like the league average park in terms of dimensions and everything like that. So this is a total neutralized example. And this column over here is just like this number divided by the sum, just because remember I changed the triple to 0, just to make sure it equals 1. You want to make sure it all equals 1 when you're doing this. That's another step. So now that we have our expectations, we can take these expectations and plug them into a run in R. So I'm going to go through that. So here's the probabilities of the at-bat, right? Remember, 10.33% chance of a single, 0.675 chance of a double, 0% chance triple, 15.07% chance home run, 8.3% chance walk, and then 59.5% chance out, right? And so we're going to run through a number of trials to simulate the outcome of the at-bat. What I do in this R run is I use a function called sample. Now, sample is a great function for Monte Carlo runs in R because you can use it to calculate a random sample. So here's how the sample command works, right? So I'm going to type this right here. So sample, there's 3 parameters you put in. The selection vector, the number of runs you want to pull out of there, and then the probabilities. Now, we already have our probabilities right here. So this right here goes into the third, prob equals bat prob, our probabilities. And obviously, we're doing one sample on the run. So the first vector is just going to be a vector between 1 and 6 because there's 6 different outcomes we can come through. And whether 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 gets picked is going to be based on the bat probabilities. I can tell you this right now, the number 3 is not going to be picked because it's 0. So that's what the sample command does. We sample based on the probabilities and pick a number between 1 and 6 based on the outcomes of each one of those things. And so now that we have bat outcomes stored to this variable right here, we can determine, okay, here's what's going to happen. So if the outcome is 1 or the outcome is 5, that means if the outcome is a single or a walk, then we're going to increase the runs count by 1. Because remember our scenario, bottom of the ninth, base is loaded, Nelson Cruz is up, and whatever happens in his at-bat is going to be what happens, right? So if he singles or walks, let's assume that all the base runners are like your standard base runners. So if it's a walk or a single, 1 run will score. If it's a double, 2 runs will score. If it's triple, 3 runs will score. And if it's a home run, 4 runs will score. Let's just assume that for the sake of simplicity. But like I said, if you're doing a real baseball Monte Carlo model, you're going to want to calculate the probabilities of, for example, a runner scoring from first base on a double, or a runner scoring from second base on a single, or the probability of a runner advancing from first to third on a single. Like, a real baseball Monte Carlo model is going to be a lot more complex than this, but for the sake of this video, I'm keeping it simple. So let's just assume those things. So if the outcome is 1 or 5, so a walk or single, then we're going to increase the runs count by 1. If it's a double, if the outcome is 2, we're going to increase by 2, and so on, right? And then we're going to run this a certain number of times. So let's do MC base, and the outcome is going to be the number of runs divided by the number of trials. So we're trying to calculate with this run the expected number of runs that will be scored as a result of Nelson Cruz's at bat here. And so let's do it one time. MC baseball example, 1 run. Okay, 4. He hit a grand slam. Okay, so obviously that's not going to be our expectation because anything can happen in one trial. That's what happens in a sporting event. It's a 1 trial simulation, but we're trying to calculate expectations. So let's do it again. Okay, he got out. 0, ball game's over. The Twins lose. 2, he hit a double. 0, he got out. 1 single or a walk, 1 single or a walk, 0, another out. So what we're going to do is now we're going to do it 1,000 times. So what would the average number of runs scored be if Nelson Cruz faced Ross Detweiler in this scenario 1,000 times? 0.848. Let's do it again. 0.84. 0.932. Okay, 0.86. So everything's falling between 0.84 and 0.93. So now let's do it 10,000 times. 0.9269. 0.9231. 0.9187, 0.9536, 0.9057. So it looks like our expectation is hovering around 0.92. Let's do it 100,000 times. 0.9273. That's probably going to be our expectation. About 0.927 runs could be expected to be scored in this scenario, all right? And that's how the baseball example works. That's what we just measured. And now let's move on to another example, basketball. So tonight, Duke and Virginia Tech are playing a game. Duke's playing at Virginia Tech, but for the sake of this example, let's assume they're playing on a neutral floor and that free throws are banned, right? I'm just trying to keep it simple because for the sake of this video, I don't want to make it too confusing. So let's just assume that only 3 things can happen in this simulation: a 2-point shot attempt, a 3-point shot attempt, or a turnover. All right, so we have Duke's offensive stats, we have Virginia Tech's defensive stats, and the national averages. So Duke on offense shoots about 62.9% twos to 37.1% threes. That's their ratio. They make about 54.5% of their 2-point shots, 35% of their threes. They rebound about 39.2% of their misses, and they turn the ball over about 18.8% of the time. Virginia Tech defensively, they only allow their opponents to shoot about 51% twos versus 48.9% threes. That probably indicates that Mike Young, the Virginia Tech coach, sets his defense up to force more three-point shots and they take away the two-point shot. That can also be an indicator of a zone defense. A zone defense usually allows a lot more twos than the national or a lot more threes than the national average than a man-to-man defense does. So that's something you might be able to infer from that. So Virginia Tech likes to take away the two and at the expense of allowing teams to shoot threes. They allow opponents to make about 46.8% of their twos. That's below the national average, which again hints towards a zone defense. They allow their opponents to make about 34.8% of their threes. That's more than the national average. Again, it hints towards a zone defense. But here's something that deviates from a zone defense. So zone defense allows their opponents to rebound offensively a lot more than the national average. That's not the case. They actually allow their opponents to have offensive rebounding percentages lower than the national average. So maybe they don't play a zone defense. And turnover percentage, 18.3%, a little bit less than the national average. So we're going to calculate expectation again, just like we did in the baseball example, by subtracting the team stats from the national averages. So Duke is right in line with the national 2-point to 3-point ratio. They make about 4.4% of their twos more than the national average, 1.7% more of their threes, and they rebound about 11.5% more of their misses than the national average team. And turnovers about in line with the national average. Virginia Tech, we already talked about how they deviate from the national average on 2.3 point percentage. They do a good job of defending the two. They allow more threes than average, and they prevent their opponents from offensive rebounding the ball a little bit less than the national average. Same with turnovers. They force about 1.1% turnovers less than the national average. And then we're going to sum those two numbers together, these two right here. And then to get our expectation, we add the sum column, column I, to the national average column, plus F5. And that's our expectation. So we can expect Duke offensive possessions tonight based on these numbers to be 51.6% two-point attempts to 48.4% three-point attempts. They're going to make about 51.2% of their twos, 36.5% of their threes. They're going to rebound about 37.4% of their misses and turn the ball over about 17.7% of the time, about 1 in 6 possessions. Now, if you're doing a real Monte Carlo simulation for basketball like I do, you would go a little bit further than this by factoring things like home court advantage, but we're not going to do that just to keep this video simple. So I'm going to put these numbers down here just to so I can refer to them. And then we need to do another set of expectations, possession expectation, right? So in this simulation, 3 things can happen on a Duke offensive possession. They're either going to turn the ball over, take a 2-point shot, or take a 3-point shot, right? So we already know what our turnover expectation is. It's 17.7%. We already know. They're going to turn the ball over 17% of the time. So that means they're going to take a field goal attempt, F17, so 1 minus F17. So 82.3% of the time. 1 minus that number is going to be their field goal attempt. And from there, we can infer what their ratio is. So field goal attempt equals F15, so 82.3% times their expected 2-point field goal percentage, or attempt percentage, 51.6% of the time, and then the same thing for threes, 82.3% of the time, field goal attempt percentage times the 3-point attempt percentage. On a Duke possession, 17.7% of the time they're going to turn it over, 42.5% of the time they're going to take it 2, 39.8% of the time they're going to take it 3. Again, to keep this example simple, I'm not factoring in free throws here. Like I said, I just want to keep it simple. So now that we have these 3 numbers, we can go and plug that into our simulation. So this is going to be a little bit more complex than the baseball simulation, but bear with me. So I have a probability vector right here. This is our possession probability. Remember, turnover expectation, 2-point attempt expectation, 3-point attempt expectation. They match these 3 numbers right here. And then the probability of a 2-point make, a 3-point make, and an offensive rebound. So we have those numbers up. And what we're trying to measure on the simulation is the amount of points per possession that Duke is going to score against Virginia Tech in the simulation. So once again, we're doing a possession outcome sample. So one of 3 things can happen. So our vector is a number between 1 and 3, 1 pull, and then the probability is going to be equal to this right here. So we're picking a number between 1 and 3 based on this probability vector. So if the possession outcome equals 1, we're not going to do anything because that's a turnover. We're not going to add to the points. But if the possession outcome equals 2, then we're going to do these things. We're going to set a variable called possession n to 0, and it's going to loop through until a shot is either made or the shot is rebounded by the defense, right? So shot probability, run if, that gives us a number between 0 and 1. So if the shot probability number is lower than the probability of a 2-point make, that means that the shot was made. We can increase the points count by 2, and we can end the possession by setting the possession n variable to 1. Otherwise, we're going to check to see if it was rebounded by the defense. Offensive rebounded probability, if that is less than or equal to the probability of an offensive rebound, the possession shot is rebounded by the defense and the possession ends. Otherwise, we're going to loop through it again and keep going until the shot is made or the shot's rebounded by the defense. Now, if the possession outcome equals 3, so a 3-point attempt, we're going to do the same thing we just did, only we're going to use the 3-point make probability instead of the 2-point make probability and increase the points count by 3 instead of 2 if it's made. And that's that. So we're going to print two things. We're going to print the offensive efficiency, or the number of points per possession, and then we're going to print the points per possession times 69, because I went through their stats, and the expected tempo of this game is going to be around 69 possessions. So how many points Duke can be expected to score based on the simulation? So let's go ahead and do this. MC, hoops, example. So let's do one trial. So one trial equals one possession. What will happen on a single possession in this trial? 2. So Duke made a 2-point shot. So extrapolated over 69 possessions, that's 138 points. But obviously they're not going to average 2 points per possession unless they have like a record offensive night. So let's do that again. 0. They turn the ball over and miss a shot that was rebounded by Virginia Tech. 0, 0, 2, so 3. So that's just off one possession. So now let's do 69 possessions, so a whole game's worth of possessions. 1.01. So Duke averaged about 1.01 points per possession, extrapolated over 69 possessions at 70 points. Let's do that again. That time they had 1.34 points per possession, extrapolated over 93. Extrapolated over 69 possessions, that's 93 points. But 69 is not a big enough sample size here. So now let's do 6,900. That's 100 games worth of possessions, right? Okay, 1.11, 76.74 points extrapolated. Now let's do 69,000. This is 1,000 games worth of possessions. Let it run. Okay, 1.1. That looks like to be our expectation. Let's do it again. 1.09, 1.1. So it looks like our expectation, how many points per possession Duke can be expected to score in this scenario is 1.1, right? Extrapolated over 69 possessions, we can expect them to score about 76.5 points in this simulation. And that's how that basketball example works, right? So I just presented you two sports scenarios, baseball and basketball, but you can do this in any sport that you convert things into probabilities. As long as you can convert stats into probabilities and expectation, you could do a Monte Carlo run. Now, you're probably asking, what's the right number of trials to do? Well, there's no right or wrong answer, but the best way to answer that is the most number of simulations you can do while keeping the time it takes to do those simulations at a reasonable time. Like, yeah, you could do 1 billion simulations, but that'll take forever. You can do 1 million or even 100,000 simulations, and that's probably not a bad thing if your computer's fast enough to be able to compute all those simulations in a reasonable amount of time, but you come to a point where you reach diminishing returns. You want to program your simulation to be fast enough to where you can do enough simulations, but you get to a point of diminishing returns. Now, I think there is a minimum. I would say the minimum's probably 400. That's usually the minimum that political pollsters use for polls. And I know a lot of people are like, how can a political poll gauge opinion based on 400 respondents? Well, you got to understand how bell curves work and standard deviations and the 95% confidence interval and all of that. But 400 is usually a good minimum that I would shoot for. But the number I use personally is 1,000, because my Monte Carlo basketball model that I run, it takes about 14 seconds to simulate my individual base Monte Carlo model. I have 2, by the way. The individual run takes about 13 seconds to do 1,000 simulations, and the team run takes about 3 to 4 seconds to do 1,000 simulations, right? So if I did 10,000, for example, that would take too long. I don't have time to let that run. And by the time the simulation was done, I bet all the lines have changed if the games haven't started yet. So you have to find that good middle ground between a high enough sample to, smooth out the randomness, but a low enough sample to where you can make all your simulations in a reasonable time frame. So I stick to 1,000. 400's a minimum, but I would try to shoot for at least 800 if you can. Now, like I said, you have a point of diminishing returns the more simulations you do. And that's why political pollsters generally don't poll more than like 1,500 to 2,000 people in a political poll, because diminishing returns, the amount of, I guess, better predicativeness you would get by surveying 10,000 people versus 1,000 people is not worth the cost. It's not. Diminishing returns. Yeah, 10,000 people is going to be more accurate than 1,000, but it's not going to be that much more accurate to justify the additional investment, expense, and time to multiply your sample by 10. And it's the same thing with this. Yeah, I could run a 10,000 simulation for my college basketball model, but as opposed to taking 15 seconds, it would take 2.5 minutes per simulation. And on a Saturday when there's 100 games, yeah, that's going to take all day. So I'm not going to do that. So you just got to find that good middle ground. But that's pretty much the 411 on Monte Carlo simulations. I mean, like I said, if you can convert anything to probabilities, you can do a Monte Carlo run. And let me go back into this. Now, for basketball Monte Carlo simulations, what I showed you right here is pretty much it. The only things you really need to factor in are obviously free throws and home advantage and stuff like that, tempo expectation. But for the most part, a basketball Monte Carlo simulation, especially if you're only using team stats, is not going to be that much more complex than this. Really, it's only going to get more complex if you're trying to simulate individual statistics in the box score as well, instead of just a final score. And that's what I do in my individual-based Monte Carlo method, because I try to calculate daily fantasy expectation, and you have to calculate individual stats for that. And things get a little bit more complex there, because then you're trying to calculate the probability of an assist or a steal or a block and stuff like that. A little bit more complex. But if you're just doing a team-based simulation, just using team stats and just trying to find a final score, this is pretty much it right here. Just factor in free throws, home advantage, you're good to go. Now, baseball, it's going to be a little bit more complex than this, obviously. This is a very basic, and baseball can get very complex when you're factoring weather, base runners, park factors, stuff like that. It gets a little bit more complex, like the probability of a runner being thrown out at home trying to score from second on a single. Like, it gets more complex. But this is a pretty base level baseball model. So unfortunately it does require a little bit more work for baseball, but for basketball, what I showed you, it's not that much far away from what my team-based Monte Carlo basketball model uses. Now for other sports like football and hockey, football, it's pretty complex. I've done a very simple Monte Carlo model for football many years ago. I don't currently do one, but getting the data that you would need for something like that is pretty tough, especially in college football, so that's why I don't bother, to be honest with you. But it is possible. Hockey, I've never done one before. I've never done a hockey model before, but I'm sure it would be pretty similar to calculating possession by possession probabilities like in basketball. For the most part, that is what Monte Carlo models entail, and hopefully this will help get you started on what exactly you need to do to make one. Well, that wraps it up for this video. Again, not that complex on the surface, but you can make it as complex or as simple as you want it to be. And that's pretty much the basics of Monte Carlo simulations. Now you know what exactly they entail and what you'll be getting yourself into if you want to pursue using one for sports betting purposes or for anything in general. This video isn't limited to sports betting. You can use Monte Carlo simulations for a lot of things outside of sports betting. So I hope that I attract an audience with this video outside of the sports betting realm. But anyway, that wraps it up for this video. Again, if you live in Tennessee, Indiana, Iowa, or Colorado, I got a link for you, BetMGM below, up to a $500 instant deposit match. Otherwise, until next time, this is Sports Betting Truth, signing off.